Hey everybody, this is Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com here in San Diego, California. Here I have a 2020 Primavera Touring, and today I'm going to show how to remove both the front and rear tire along with changing the brake shoes in the rear and brake pads in the front. Just something you may encounter as a home mechanic, or maybe you're running a shop and just curious on how to do it, the steps and the tools required. So let's jump right into it, and I'll go over the part numbers and the tools needed. So here in the United States, the Primavera was introduced in early 2014. 2014 all the way up until 2017, I think, they had 11-inch tires on them. So the front would have a 110/70/11 and the rear is a 120/70/11. Anything after that, they went to a 12-inch tire, just like the Sprint. And if you have the 12-inch equipped Primavera or a 12-inch Sprint 150 or even the 50, very similar steps. If sizes of the tires would be a 110/70/12 for the front and a 120/70/12 for the rear. And it's a rear tire rated tire. Not all 120/70/12 tires are rated for use on the rear. So you want to make sure you get the correct load rating for the rear tire. We have all those tires available at our web shop, ScooterWest.com. We have many tire packages that if you buy a pair of front and rear tires, it's always nice to have a fresh set of shoes. You know, obviously the rears wear about twice or 3 times more frequently than the front, but say the front's marginal, just do them both. That's my motto to it. The scooter rides so much nicer with a fresh set of tires. We have Pirellis, Continentals, Michelins, Shinko, Kenda, even starting to carry some of the Dunlops. You can check our web store for details on the pricing and what we have available. But in addition to the tires to do a tire job, of course, you're going to need a cotter pin for the rear. Part number on this guy is 012789. Just retains the hub nut on the rear. Say you're doing the brake pads or brake shoes in the rear, brake pads up front on the Primavera Sprint, all pretty much the same for the 150s. The 50s and Electrica have a little bit smaller disc brake up front, but they use the same rear brake. Part number for the rear brake shoes is BS816. We have the original Piaggio brake shoes and oftentimes aftermarket brake shoes that are high quality but less expensive. For the front brakes, our part number is BP250, and again, we have aftermarket high performance front brakes. We have just the standard Piaggio original brake pads. These scooters have always had the organic compound pads on them. They last quite a long time. I rarely see the front worn out, even on high miles Primaveras, but I like high performance stuff. I usually put the centered brakes, even though they do tend to eat up the brake rotor a little quicker, but the stopping power is extra nice. And with the ABS braking system up front, not much worry about locking up the brakes if you're too heavy on the brakes. I would just rather have the feel of the centered brakes. A couple different options on our website. Again, BS 816 for the rear, BP 250 for the front. All right, into the tools that are needed for the job. You're gonna need a 24mm socket, and if you have an impact wrench, that makes the job a little easier. Remove the center nut. A 6mm Allen. Can be anything as simple as the standard L-shaped Allen to something that attaches to your socket, which is preferable. To get the muffler off, in addition to the Allen, you're gonna need a 10mm socket, and preferably on a wobble, or even better, there's a specific snap-on socket that works very well. I'll put the part number in the description. It's very expensive. I don't really recommend the home user, but this thing works so perfect for all the Vespa exhaust nuts. I've featured in other videos where I've taken the exhaust off. For servicing the front brakes, in addition to a 6mm Allen, you're going to need a 5mm Allen. To get the cotter pin off, the best tool is just a large pair of diagonal pliers. So these are cutters, but they work very well for prying out the cotter pin. Of course, you'll need a ratchet of some sort. Highly recommend a torque wrench. Come on, you're dealing with the brakes and the tires. The last thing you want them to do is fall off, or if you over tighten them, something breaks unnecessary. Not a good idea. You could use a needle nose to pull the pin through. With any of the fuel injected bikes, they typically have an O2 sensor, so there's going to be a connection that ties to the sensor that's on the exhaust pipe. Sensor being located right up here. Sometimes you'll need a Torx driver, T25 Torx driver, to gain access to where the connector is located, so you could pull the muffler all the way off. Or you could cheat it and leave it connected, but don't want to pull the wires out of the sensor. All right, let's jump onto the front, the easiest tire to remove. So if you change a tire on a car, if you can do that, you can definitely do the front tire on pretty much any Vespa. Real simple design with a single-sided swing arm, much easier than most other motorcycles and scooters that have forks on both sides. You're gonna need something to support the frame. Keep in mind the scooter's on a center stand, and I have the aid of a lift that brings it up to my level. Kind of helps. You can do it on the ground as well. Well, up front, you have the 5 lug nuts, or Allen bolts. Lug nuts, probably not really the proper term, because that would be a nut that goes over a stud, but these are bolts. And these have never been cracked open. This is a demo bike that I've been riding quite a bit at the shop. Doesn't need new tires, but I'm gonna just take it off. So right now I'm just breaking free all 5 of the lug nuts. And if you notice the pattern, I'm going kind of in a crisscross star pattern. Pretty much that's all it takes. And once you have them all loose, this little scissor jack thing is useful, something we don't sell, but you could find. You can always improvise. The ubiquitous cinder block, hopefully with a towel on top, would work. You know, they're about 8 inches tall, and it's just the right amount to kind of hold the scooter off the front tire off the ground. And it's like a tripod. The scooter is really stable right now on that, so no worries there. And go back to the 5 lug nuts and hit the bench with the ratchet. It's a really important trick. Let me see if I can turn this so the camera can get this. No big deal, just pretty much pull the screws out. Of course, if you have power tools, it goes a little quicker. And what do we have here? You have a wave washer and a flat washer. And take a look at that wave washer, make sure it still has a little wave to it, kind of a distorted like wave in it, pretty much, and that just helps aid with locking this bolt in place. They're all the same, you know, leave the washers on there so they're not misplaced. Not dealing with an 80-pound truck tire. Got the tire off. Same steps on any other modern Vespa. Identical setup they've been using ever since 1996, starting with the ET4 with the 5 lug nuts. So now I'm going to show how to remove these brake pads. Those are the green metal back plates that are there. A pair of 5mm Allens. I haven't loosened the caliper, but I'm going to, again, break both of those free. So now they're both crack loose. You could just go ahead and unthread the Allen screws all the way. Top one typically just has a wave washer alone. And we'll go ahead and remove the lower one. Be careful with the speed sensor wire. And the bottom one, on this one, it has a wave washer. I have seen it where on the bottom one, they've had a wave washer and a flat washer. I don't know why they do the combination of both, but on some, but definitely this is from the factory. Looks like they just have the wave washer. So the caliper separated. You see this little clip? This holds the speed sensor wire. The wire pulls right away. So there's your brake pads right there. And you could see reveals the piston. and that's what puts the pressure on the brake pads. Other part of the caliper is these are sliding pins. You can see that they do slide, so that allows this whole caliper to slide, and that's how they're able to do just a pair of pistons, even though it puts equal force on both the inner and outer brake pads right there. So if you're unfamiliar with how much life you get on a brake pad, these are nearly new. This scooter has about 150 miles on it. They're nearly new. So this is the metal back plate. That little section is the steel back plate on both sides. And this whole entire section right here, that's the friction material. And when the friction material gets to the last millimeter or about 1/16 of an inch, that's pretty much the end of the life, or even 2 millimeters. One thing is, oftentimes these pads don't wear evenly, so when they're at the very last amount of meat or the friction material, they sometimes will, they'll begin to touch the metal pad to the rotor, and will make that distinctive kind of metallic screeching noise, and the brakes aren't very effective as well. Before you remove the pads, even with these new ones, you can see the pistons are partly out. Just stick a flat blade screwdriver. It doesn't take much force. If you got a lot of rust on the brake caliper, you may have some problems, and it may damage the seals in there. So keep that in mind. If those pistons look rusty, you may run into problems. So you want to retract the 2 pistons before you start this job. Go ahead and flip the caliper over, and we'll go ahead and remove this first screw here. And you'll see there's some friction on this. If you push on the pads a little bit, it relieves the friction. You're able to pull this sliding pin out. Take a look at your sliding pin, make sure there's no grooves in it. If the parts are heavily worn on the whole caliper, I just recommend replacing the whole caliper. There are some service parts for these calipers, but they're generally not worth messing with. Pretty affordable for a complete caliper. They also include brand new brake pads, so keep that in mind. But you also will need to bleed the brakes, and it may be difficult with these ABS models as a home mechanic. If you have air in the ABS pump, you may need to take it to a dealer, unfortunately, to run it through some special procedures to get the air out of the brakes. So continue to hold pressure on the brake pads. Pull the second pin out, and voila, pads are going to come out. So this is the inner pad. It's got this little extra hook here, and the outer pad kind of slides out, and that's pretty much how you get the pads out. Take a peek in there. This is the anti-squeal plate, so it keeps pressure on the pads and prevents or minimizes or prevents the squealing from the brakes. If that tang is all out of shape, it's possible sometimes to bend it back into shape. If not, you may need to replace the caliper because that part's not replaceable. You see the pair of pistons. Go ahead and put the pads in. These are, no need to change them out unless I wanted some performance pads. So you kind of set the first pad in there, and the second pad. And believe it or not, I've had a scooter come in with the pads upside down. So is the metal rubbing on the brake rotor. Not a good situation. So I'm pushing on the pads because otherwise the pistons aren't going to go in there. And you can see the gap is quite open. So that's kind of the position you want to hold them in. They have some Loctite on there. That's if you take the pads out a couple times, that Loctite will break down, and you'll just need to apply some blue Loctite to it. So just hand tight it first. And if you're watching this and you have a GTS, so far everything's identical on a Vespa GTS, doing the same steps for removing the front wheel and removing the caliper. Difference on a GTS is going to have a disc brake on the rear. So one last thing, also check if you have the pads out. If this, if the scooter's like 5 years older, I would take this all apart, and there's some grease that you want to put into these rubber boots. Just this very small amount of grease. You can see some of the grease that's from the factories oozed out. this needs to slide real smoothly. You know, and if there's excessive free play in there, well, then you have some problems. Maybe worth just replacing the caliper at that point. Last thing to check before you replace the pads is your brake rotor. Nearly all brake rotors, they'll have a marking of the minimum thickness. Unfortunately, it's right underneath this ABS tone wheel. And it's the marking on there is the minimum thickness of the rotor. It looks like it's 3.5. And if you have a micrometer, you can measure the area, this kind of glossy area where the pads rub, and measure that. And if it's under that measurement in any part of the rotor, it's advisable to replace the rotor. And further down, it shows the direction of the rotor. You can install the rotor either direction, but there's a recommended direction, and it's just the orientation of the vent holes. And these Primavera rotors are a little bit thinner than and smaller than the one found on a GTS. So get the pad back on there, or with the brake caliper, just slide it over back into the place. You know, the pads have been pushed in, and I would just recommend getting the pair of screws started. So you kind of feel your way around. There you go, it's engaged. And one other advisable thing, it's not necessary, but if you want the new pads to seat quicker, you could scuff the rotor with, you know, 80 grit sandpaper. Or even Scotch-Brite pad. So you want to torque these two bolts 16 foot-pounds. Keep in mind that the scooter's off, so if you crank on it too hard, you might topple the scooter. I'm just going to watch the digital display on this thing. There we go, and you see the yellow dots pretty much line up. You know, because that's what they've torqued them from the factory. Go ahead and just snug both those. I mean, if you're going to torque them, maybe 7 or 8 foot-pounds at the very most. They don't need much. Since the brake pistons are retracted, the lever, watch what it's going to do. It's going to go to the grip. That's not a good thing. So go ahead and pump the brakes up. And as long as the brake fluid is adequate and there's no air in the system, that's the way it should feel. They may have a little bit of a mushy feel for the first 100 miles, just with the new brake pads, since they need to seat into the rotor. May have some irregularities that need to seat in. But that's pretty much how you change the brake pads, and we got the wheel off. Let's move on to the rear. So the first order of business to start on removing the rear wheel is get the muffler out of the way. With these fuel-injected scooters, they do have a sensor that's in the header pipe. You disconnect the connector that ties to that sensor. On this 2020 Primavera, they do have a cover. All the earlier models, they did not have a cover. So a pair of screws, just using the T25 Torx driver. Remove the screws from this little cover. And go ahead and lift the cover off. On the earlier models, they have a clip that holds the O2 sensor connector. Primaveras and Sprints have always had a 4-pin connector for the sensor. These later models, it snaps out of this plastic thing here. Earlier models, they may have clips that retain it, so it's a little different. This little tab right here, just lift it and pull it right off, and then you'll be able to push the wire down. So it's advisable to do this job when the muffler's cool. This scooter hasn't been started for a while, so no issues there. It is possible to do with a warm muffler. My techs have to do that quite a bit because customers come in for a pit stop and just want a tire. We'll usually handle the muffler with a welding glove. I'm just popping the O2 sensor wire out of this little clip right here, and now the sensor wire is dangling and on its own. So the header studs and nuts are pretty difficult to get to on these models. Definitely the wobble is going to make the job much easier. Camera is not going to get this very well, but there's a pair of nuts and you can kind of go through the swing arm You know, different ways work best, but usually just right from the side like this is. And typically I'll just break the first one free, then move on to the second one, and just go ahead and break it free. Now this one's loose, and go back to the first one and break it free. If you don't have a wobble, it is possible to get a little wrench up there, and then you're going to want to spin the pair of nuts off. I had some customer, they mailed me a piece of 3/8 fuel line, and I was like, oh, what's this for? And I read the note he included. He sent it to me in service, and he said it worked well for him. He put a piece of tube up there, that 3/8 fuel line tube, so that's like the inner diameter, and it fit over the nuts, so he's able to spin the nuts without, you know, to get them out easier. But it's nice having a wobble. That's a really good quality wobble. Kind of, I feel like I'm cheating with all these nice tools here. It's like no fair, you know. In reality, you know, doing this at home, you don't have all the tools of the trade, but get them out pretty easy. And the idea is if you put a rubber tube off it, you could spin that off. So a pair of brass nuts, or they're actually copper coated steel nuts. Pretty specific, we sell those, we always have those in stock. You have the pair of Allen bolts that hold the muffler. So just go ahead and break the two bolts free. Now I'll typically remove the lower bolt. And if you're doing this on an ET4 or LX, it would be nearly identical, minus the O2 sensor, unless you have a fuel injected model. GTS is a little different, I think I've covered that. So there's the lower screw. I'll show you the washers that are pretty specific. As long as these things are tightened correctly, they last a very long time. I never see these strip out. It's always user error on installation. The bolts rattle out, and if you're only holding the muffler with one bolt, it usually will strip or break the bolt. So get the second bolt out. Some models, like the LX, they have two different size bolts, so keep that in mind. It's Primavera, they use the same. So I'm rocking the back of the pipe up and dropping the header down. So it's kind of a motion of doing both of those at the same time. Of course, the O2 sensor is always a little bit of the pain in the butt, but so kind of rock the header down, rock the rear of the muffler up, and it drops right out of the way. So here we got the rear wheel in all its glory, easy to access at this point. So you have the cotter pin on there. Get the diagonal cutters and go ahead and just fold it up. I'm not cutting the cotter pin. I'm using the cutters to kind of manipulate the two wings on the nut. And then you could bend it out, grab midway down the diagonal pliers, and then just pry against the cap in there. And see how you're just levering out? That's destroyed. You throw that thing away. Don't ever reuse those unless it's absolutely necessary. Don't put a nail in there. Cotter pins don't cost much. So two ways to get the center nut off. You could cheat with a large impact wrench, whether it's an air or electric wrench, or use something like a breaker bar, or even a large ratchet. If you stepped on this, it would put enough force onto that nut to loosen it up. So the method without any fancy tools, just basic hand tools. You can have a partner or somebody hold the rear brake as tight as they can, or you can wedge a flat blade screwdriver into the brake mechanism. Put a large breaker bar on the center nut, and then go ahead and loosen that nut right up. Go ahead and remove the rest of the nut. If your brake shoes are heavily worn, sometimes you may not be able to get this hub off. Oftentimes this step may make it easier to remove the the brake pads, especially if they're adjusted tighten. So the inner part of this is a lock nut. I'm gonna go ahead and spin that free. And then the brake adjuster itself is this one on the end. So I can do that by hand. I'm gonna take all the free play, or have this as loose as it needs to be. You know, right now the levers are probably really sloppy. Left hand brake lever. And then now we'll be able to remove the hub without any issues. So just pull the wheel straight off. One thing it's going to catch on in the United States, they're going to have this reflector on there, and you just got to tip the wheel out of the way. You have a large flat washer, it does have some grease on it, and on the inside, this usually stays behind. This is a large thrust washer. You want to make sure that's in place, otherwise the brakes won't operate correctly. So Primaveras and Sprints have always had the drum brake in the rear. It's perfectly effective for the operation. Fortunately, it doesn't have anti-lock brakes, being a completely mechanical system. They're very reliable and low maintenance. The only maintenance they really need is adjustment of the rear brake cable until the brake shoes wear out. These brake shoes are nearly new. You could see they have about almost 4 millimeters of material, about 1/8 inch. When they're down to about 1/16 of an inch and there's no more adjustment, or this little tang right here lines up with this tang when you pull the brakes, so hypothetically if it pulls in there, this would go a little further. When it's to that tang, that's the wear limit on the brakes. So you can see how the brakes work. This little cam arm acts on both these brake shoes. There's a pair of springs that hold it back. In the shop, sometimes I'll just take a punch or a hammer and hit both of these tangs. They'll break very easily. That's if I don't want to reuse the shoes. I just want to throw them away. Break this and break that. Bang, bang, and that's one way to get them off real quickly, like I like to do in a shop environment. Do the job nice and quickly, but you could get a flat blade screwdriver under here, and you could just see I'm just levering them off. Keep in mind these are under spring tension, just like that. Get your fingers between there, it's gonna hurt. And they pull right off. So if you have a new set of brake shoes, they would look like this. Sometimes these clips are loose, and oftentimes they come with a pair of springs. Before you do the brake shoes, it may be advisable if the scooter's high miles, take this whole entire pin apart. I'm not going to show how to do it. You can grease this pin in here. But at minimum, put a real small amount of grease on both these. Very small amount. You don't want it contaminating your brake shoes. Set up the new brake shoes. The springs are kind of an odd arrangement on most brake shoes. So it hooks on one side and then it hooks the other, the back side on the other one there. So. And it's kind of a little bit of a trick getting them all, or the pair of springs. And there you go, it's prepared. And the way I like to put them on is I'll start top and I'll use just put some force into this. I'm holding the top, and then you could just hold it in place. You don't need a hammer for this, but see how it snaps into place? And it's the spring tension that holds them in place. So that's how you change the brake shoes. Some of the problems I've seen, very, very rare, but on older LX, the ET4, sometimes the brake spring will break and it will chew up inside the brake drum. Just like the front brake, there is a measurement for the brake drum. I rarely see them worn out. I've seen some grooves in them just from high miles scooters, or if somebody drags the brakes so much that overheats the wheel and drum, which are one assembly. A car drum brake, it would be a separate cast iron drum and then a steel or aluminum wheel. So here's the drum. It's in perfect shape. There's no cracks in the steel lining. This is an aluminum wheel with a steel cast in insert for the brakes. Typically I clean this all out with brake spray cleaner. You can wipe it with a clean rag to get any of the brake dust out of there. Again, you could scuff that with 80 grit sandpaper all the way around to get the surface, the brake free. Perfect time to clean your rims. Get all the dirt and dust out of them, and just clean them with regular dish soap or car wash soap, whatever, just something mild. Don't spray brake cleaner all over this powder coat surface. Oftentimes will dull the surface. So typically the home mechanic's not going to have a tire machine to change tubeless tires on their own. Fortunately with the Vespa, once you support the center, the scooter can stand on its own without both of the tires installed. So you're able to take it to a tire shop, your local scooter shop hopefully, or a motorcycle shop, and they can handle swapping the tires onto your rims. So oftentimes the tire machines may have something that goes through the center of the wheel. Well, the rear is no problem because it has an axle hole. On the front there's this little hubcap here, and you can take the back end of a socket, you know, the plastic butt end of a ratchet, not a socket, and pop that out. And don't get too crazy because you end up putting little dents in it, and it's just a little cleaner than getting a screwdriver between it where you may mar up the surface. So before you take it to a shop, I'd recommend taking the little hubcap out. So I don't expect any home mechanic to have a setup like this. It's just a run-of-the-mill arm style automatic changer. There's manual changers out there. You certainly could improvise and just get the good old tire irons out and get between the tire and eventually get it off. You probably mar up the rim pretty good. This is a GTS rim. They're all the same size as that 12-inch Primavera wheel, but I'll show you typically how I do it, just to show you how tires would be changed. So I always recommend changing the valve stem. Typically there's no reason to saving it. Just take a sharp knife and get between the rubber stem, and it allows the air right out. So I just cut that off, and then you can push the remains of the stem right through the back of the stem, throw that away. Next, you gotta pop the bead on this tire. So let me show how that works on this machine here. Every machine's different. They're all pretty similar at the end of the day, so pretty dangerous machine if you get your hands in the wrong spot. That does a tremendous amount of force to break that bead, so that's why it uses an air cylinder to. So now you can see the tire's been separated from the bead of the rim. Next thing, this is the next dangerous part. If you get your fingers in here, it's probably not a good thing. And I usually just get the timing just right. And I didn't do it there, so. And all that does is grabs and centers the rim in the machine, because it can accommodate rims anywhere from 6-inch all the way up to like, you know, big huge 30-inch rims or something. So this is an arm that's kind of set up for scooter wheels. It's actually an arm for a car wheel. So I'm dropping that down. Then there's a lock that locks this arm up and down, you know, and then for the sweep, usually you will set this just where it's away from the rim. The idea is nothing touches the rim when you take the tire off. Got some soapy water right here, just to kind of get it lubricated. And check this out. This is the machine right here. You push the tire into the bead, and you pry the tire over that arm there. And I'm pressing a pedal that just pretty much spins the whole entire table. And you grab the second bead. And there's a little bit of, I think my air pressure is off. That's the problem. The guys turned off the shop air. I was like, because this arm relies on the air pressure to hold the rim. Of course, you got to dispose of these in usually the correct way. We have a company recycle them or whatever they do, chop them up and turn them into playground sets. I have no idea. Clean the inside of the rim. You want to check the bead all the way around. If you had a tire that's always leaking, you may have a rough surface, or if there's fix-a-flat in here, it may have ruined the rim. Put a new stem in there. Pretty straightforward, just a little standard stem. And I do have a lubricant. Even soapy water would work. That's a little bit much, but And there's a special tool that pulls those right through. So it sticks right in there, it threads onto the stem. Takes quite a bit of pull it through, and there you go. So pop a new tire on. I'm too lazy to go get a new tire for this rim, but I have a different tire that has more tread than the last one. One thing to keep in mind, they always have a rotation. This is a rear. So the wheel goes this direction, bolted onto the bike, the scooter, and the rear is this direction. And front tires, sometimes just how the tread pattern, it may be the same tread, it may be reversed. Every tire is a little different. There's soapy water, or you could use a special tire lubricant. That's what this is. Don't really recommend using motor oil or anything. And the same machine, and they go on quicker than they come off. So the machine pretty much, all it's doing is prying the speed over the edge. And again, I just use that as an example, pulled the arm away, released it. And typically you don't need to take the Schrader valve out. That's the little valve inside the stem, and it should seat right up. See how there's a little leakage? Sometimes you got to get it moved around. Keep your fingers out of the bead. It's going to make 2 pops, and that's when you know the tire's seated. So first pop, second pop. There you go, inflated to the correct pressure. Primavera Sprint, not necessary to balance the wheels. They don't go quite fast enough to justify that. If you're changing a tire on anything that's freeway capable, like that's going to go sustained 70 miles an hour or 110 kilometers an hour, I would recommend balancing the wheel. And there's wheel weights. I have a special balancer that's all set up for Vespa wheels, but pretty much that's the gist of how you change a tire with the machine. And pretty much any shop's going to do the same way. Maybe they're old school and they have an older manual machine. And I would definitely clean the rim up before I'd put that on. That was just an example there. So we have a new front tire mounted. Just kidding, this is a new bike, so it's already got a front tire mounted. But so we're going to put this back on. And while I was at it, I went ahead and put a rear mud flap on this Primavera. Part number on this is MF15. Good for keeping the rocks from chipping the bottom of the frame, which is a common problem with Vespas, vintage Vespas, new Vespas. I've seen some Vespas where the bottoms are rusted out. Not too common here in California, but I've heard the horror stories of frames rusting out. A lot of times you can prevent rust by just good upkeep, cleaning the scooter. You know, people just don't take care of their stuff. So I went ahead and slid the wheel right on. Straightforward enough. Just line up the 5 bolts, and the wheel, it has this flange in the center. It kind of self-centers. Very, very simple. So you see I'm getting these all started. You don't want to just go to town and tighten them, you know, like crazy. So now we'll just go back and forth between the 5 screws here. Lower our jack, or pull the cinder block out, or whatever means you had to lift the front tire. I'm going to snug all these bolts. Typically they're torqued to 16 foot-pounds, so I'll set a torque wrench to do the job. And with the tire on the ground, it's no big deal because there's enough friction. It's not going to roll the scooter off. You could torque them right to 16 and it's not going to go away on you. So I had them all bottomed out, and then I'll just go in like kind of a star fashion. Make sure you don't miss any of them. That's the worst thing if you're not paying attention. You can miss one, that would be not good because you'd end up with a loose lug nut. And I even put the one that had the marking on it back in the same spot. So they're all torqued. Take your little hubcap and go ahead and just press it in place. If you can't use your fist to do it, you can use a rubber mallet to tap it in place. There it is. Don't want to go to town because you can dent them pretty easily. And there's the front tire, all mounted, all torqued in place. Check your inflation. If somebody changed a tire for you, likely, unless you told them specific pressure, it's not the correct inflation. Typically, anywhere from 25 to 30 is like a good range. I'd like to do them at 26. The little badge on the VIN plate on the scooter also will indicate the pressure for the front and rear tire, the recommended pressure that is. So a happy rim is a clean rim. Always like to clean the wheels before I put them back on. Just use a rag that preferably you don't clean the whole scooter with. There's a small amount of grease already in here. If not, I would put a small amount of grease on those inside splines. Again, don't get too crazy putting grease on there, because if it gets on your rear brake shoes, you're gonna have a problem. And then you just wanna lift the tire into place and just line it up with the axle shaft, kind of rotate it. I have the rear brake still very loose, because if they're tight, you're never gonna get these over the drum brake. So kind of work it. Make sure that thick washer that I spoke of is in place. Put your thin washer and the nut. Always check the condition of these. If they're questionable, just be worth replacing them. So we're gonna go ahead and tighten this up. It's gonna get very tight very quick. Get a torque wrench set at the 80 foot-pounds. And just like removing the tire with the breaker bar, I'm gonna go ahead and put some leverage on the rear brake. So tons of leverage on the brake. Almost there. 80 foot-pounds. And tire didn't move anywhere, it's all good. Sometimes with new brakes, it may slip. You can take the scooter off the stand, have somebody sit on the scooter, it's not gonna, and hold the brake. That's one way to do it. Put the cap back on. This has lots of positions. So ideally you have it on a position where you see the hole that's milled through the shaft, but no problems there. So I have the hole present. It's torqued at 80 foot-pounds, drop a cotter pin through. Part number on that again is 012789. I think it's the correct one for this. I also have all the part numbers in the description. So I pulled that through, that's snug right there. And here's the magic trick to get a nice loop on these. So grab it with the diagonal pliers. And see that? I'm just rotating the wheel. I see people try to bend them over and they always look kind of haphazard. So, and it's nice not to have these tangs. You know, the tangs, if they're tucked in, they're less likely to catch things. So that's how you do a cotter pin right there, just like that. I'm just grabbing them from the very end, so I'm not compromising the strength of it. Old cotter pin, that's trash. Now let's get the muffler back on. So here's a muffler. It's a metal-to-metal seal. There's a copper ring that's up in the head. Typically, it doesn't need replacement. Maybe after the muffler's been off like 5 times, it may be advisable to pry it out and replace that copper gasket. You can tap a new one in place or use some high temperature silicone, a very small dab of it just to hold it in place. It doesn't affect the sensor. So pretty much, it's cold pipe. I'm gonna get down at the level of the pipe. Hopefully the camera gets it. And the problem is you kind of got to clear a bunch of stuff when you're getting these pipes up into place. So pretty much you can see how I started from the front and rocked the rear up. And now that I'm supporting the pipe, just go ahead and put one of the screws in. Keep in mind if it's an LX or not this style motor, it may have 2 different size bolts. So you want to get that correct. You know, don't want to put the short bolt because then it won't tighten down correctly. Go ahead and slide the flange up there. Of course, with a cool motor, it's a lot easier than burning your fingers. Take the nut, and you don't really see what's going on, but I'm holding the flange up against the engine, and I'm going to get the 2 nuts started. So it's a little tight up there. And pretty difficult to see what you're doing. You know. Alternatively, you could just put the nut in a good quality wobble that doesn't want to flop, and just sight where it goes and just get it started. Make sure it doesn't cross thread. You don't want to mess with these things. You want to do these perfect, because when you break the studs off in the head, you got a lot more problems. So got that one started. Again, you could do it by hand like this, you know, kind of get your fingers up in there and get it started. Got big hands. It's obviously going to be pretty difficult. And I'll go ahead and hand tighten this one as well. So at this point, I'm just hand tightening both these header bolts, because so that's the order. Right now, this is all loose right now, but the header's up in place. So I'll go ahead and get this one in, the upper bolt. And one thing about these, I didn't really show the washers. There's like two special washers. There's a really thick flat washer that goes against the muffler, and then there's one that has like a serrated surface kind of that bites into the Allen bolt. And I'm lifting on the muffler to take a little pressure off the bolts, because the muffler is resting on the bolts, then you're going to have problems. So as far as I'm going to take these is right where they are hand tight. Then I'll go back to the pair of fasteners up in here. And if you want to torque them with a torque wrench, 11 foot-pounds is all they need. I have a pretty good feel for these with a little short wrench here to ratchet. So got that one about a quarter turn, then I'll move on to the other one. I'm trying to stay out of the way. Usually I like to sight this. Then back to the rear one, so maybe 2 steps go between the two after you hand tighten it. So there we go. So that's about 11 foot-pounds. See, I'm just kind of giving it a twist with my wrist, and that's all it needs, and then move it back to the front. I'm using my fingers here to kind of help guide the wobble socket. And there you go. So those both are tight. Rear 2 fasteners, give a torque wrench, 16 foot-pounds. Just slightly higher, but and there you go. So muffler's all physically attached. We're gonna pop this wire back in this clip, and from the top make the connection. Early on, I've had people like, check engine lights on, or it doesn't run right. Well, the connector wasn't hooked back up after the muffler was reinstalled. So pretty straightforward, just route the connector where it needs to go, and when you hit a click, you know the connector's snapped in place, and then go ahead and snap it in the retainer there. Little cover can go back on, and towards the right side of the scooter, it's got little snap tabs, and then there's the 2 screws. So after wheels installed and all torqued down, you're going to need to adjust your rear brake. So the lock nut, that's free right now. That's a ton of free play. So you know, you can hold the arm, kind of spin that adjuster right there. It's got like kind of a little eccentric thing where it just kind of wants to stay in certain notches there. And typically the very end of the lever, the ball of the lever, when you adjust the brakes, I typically get it where it pulls in about 25 millimeters or an inch, something like that. It's all personal preference. Sometimes you want to have the lever a little closer, you could back it off. If you want it a little tighter, you could pull it in. Don't go too tight. If you're less than 3/4 of an inch, as the brakes heat up, they sometimes will start to drag, and then you'd end up with a bigger problem down the road where the brakes are dragging more and more as they get hot. So once you have the adjustment where you want it, this thing kind of snaps into place. Just go back there and give that a little snug. And there's your brakes all adjusted with fresh brake shoes in the rear. So there you go, all the steps to changing your own brakes and tires on a modern Vespa Primavera or Sprint. Also applies to pretty much the LX and ET4, ET2 range, any of the 50cc Vespas, all pretty much nearly identical steps. A GTS is a little bit more to it, especially on the rear. The front's gonna be the same. But hope everybody liked that. Kind of gives you an idea of how you can change the tires on your own, all the way up until you need the machine. There's machines that you could use at home. There are manual machines that are affordable if you're going to change enough tires, but I just recommend taking it to the professionals. Hope you found it all interesting. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook, Vespa Motorsport. For all things Vespa, check us out, scooterwest.com. I'll have all the part numbers for everything used for this whole job in the description. Until next time here, Robot.